you understand, Russia is with us. They're with Trump.
Russia is with us?
Russia is with Trump.
Who do you think is going to win this upcoming election? Do you think it's a coin flip? Do you think that Biden's still the favorite?
Man, it's such a question. I mean,
yeah, so let's jump into January 6th real quick. I go to a lot of these rallies and I talk to Trump supporters. And January 6th, Ukraine, just topics revolving around democracy. Those are always what I like to hammer home when I'm talking to MAGA supporters. And they can never connect the dots between Donald Trump's rhetoric and the attack on the Capitol. And what I always say is you can draw a direct line between Donald Trump's rhetoric leading up to the election, after the election, even on January 6th. You can draw a direct line from that, him saying all of our institutions are rigged, everything is against you, to his supporters walking from the ellipse to the Capitol, chanting stuff like hang Mike Pence, 1776. And nobody gets it. Nobody can connect that line. So what would be your, let's say, pitch to a Trump supporter if you were talking to them one-on-one to convince them that January 6th was a function of Donald Trump's rhetoric?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two big things. So let's take the direct line. The direct line, everything you mentioned, and I would add to that, we can actually, and we showed this in one of our hearings, and I guess, there's always things that I wish we could go back and show twice, right, in the same hearing. One of those, though, was that when he tweeted, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what needed to be done. When he made that tweet, you can directly correlate the timestamp of that tweet. We can correlate people in the crowd, showing their phones and saying, look, this is what Donald Trump sent, and then the acceleration of violence. So you can see a direct link between Donald Trump saying Mike Pence didn't do what he needed to do and an acceleration of violence as a result of that. On the indirect side of things, and what I would say to a MAGA supporter to convince them is pretty simple, because we can speak the same language. I mean, I grew up around this stuff, which is, look, we were a country founded on the idea of revolution, and we're proud of that. And honestly, we should be. We threw off the most powerful empire because we believe that taxation can only exist with representation. That said, you always hear people say, like, the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed by the blood of patriots. Well, yeah, if we lived under an authoritarian government, that's true. The problem is in a system of democracy, when almost half of the country is convinced that an election is stolen, okay? And who was the one convincing them an election was stolen before the election, during, and after? It was only Donald Trump. And then he had his minions come in. When you can convince a significant part of the country the election was stolen, January 6th shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody. I mean, look, if I really believed, Adam, that the election had been stolen, I would have been at the Capitol as a congressman doing violent stuff on January 6th. And this is the issue, is democracy, it's all about having people with different ideas. That's a great thing. But the only thing we have to agree on, no issue, except that we have to agree on that elections are free, fair, and if you're eligible to vote, you can vote. When you convince somebody an election's rigged, you take away that basic system of trust, and violence is the inevitable result. And I think, if I'm telling that to a MAGA person, they'll never admit it, but they understand that language and they're like, yeah, I get it. And that's what I would say is the most powerful. I think in the depth of their heart, they all, or most of them, know it. They just are unwilling to actually look at it and acknowledge it.
Yeah, you're giving me my talking points for the next rally. I mean, that acceleration of violence part is really, really crucial in my opinion. And also just the date and the time of Donald Trump's rally at the Ellipse, I think is incredibly important, because that allowed people to walk over while Mike Pence was certifying the results of the election. And then we saw the peaceful transfer of power get delayed for the first time in American history, right?
Yeah, and here's the other thing that's kind of underreported is, and this wasn't necessarily the big intention by Donald Trump, but to an extent this was kind of seen as a side intention, was a hope to delay the certification past January 6th, which is why, Nancy Pelosi was, and frankly Mitch McConnell were very serious about saying we have to finish this certification. They wanted to delay it past January 6th. It technically was, because it happened in the early morning of the 7th, but delay it enough that they could go to the Supreme Court, the oppositions to the election, and say, look, according to the Constitution, if Congress doesn't certify this, or they don't certify a winner, then Congress votes for the next president. And there was at least a modicum of people that made the decision that if they could get January 6th, like the actual certification somehow canceled or delayed indefinitely, that they could then petition the Supreme Court to say, yes, Congress can now vote, or get, Mike Pence to declare Congress will now vote for the president. Obviously, Republicans own the majority of its delegation, so it's not an actual straight up and down vote, and it would have been Donald Trump. So there were a lot of things that happened before the election, and January 6th that didn't get enough attention, but this was a organized effort to disenfranchise the majority of American voters.
Yep. And would you agree with the idea that even if we remove the attack of the Capitol on January 6th, we can still classify Donald Trump's actions as a coup because of the unconstitutional theory written by John Eastman, his attempt to have Mike Pence unilaterally choose slates of electors in different states? Would you still classify it as a coup even if we removed that attack on January 6th?
I guess I would classify it as something close to a coup. A coup in my mind has to have an action behind it. January 6th was that action. But if you take, as you're saying here, if you take all the things that happened leading up to that and you put that together in a package, it looks like a coup because, look, sitting down with the Department of Justice, and this is something that needs to worry all of us for if Donald Trump wins re-election. We have always made this assumption in our country, with very few exceptions, that the DOJ is an independent, yes, it's under the president, but it really just executes laws and, X, Y, and Z. And that has been the case. That doesn't have to be the case. The DOJ could literally operate as a law enforcement branch of the president of the United States. And so when Donald Trump sat down in, I think it was mid-December, with, after Bill Barr had resigned, with the acting attorney general and then his wannabe attorney general, and said to Jeff Rosen, just say the election was corrupt. That's all I need from you. Just say it was corrupt. You don't have to do anything else. Leave the rest to me and the Republican members of Congress. What you see in that is Donald Trump's play in everything, where all he wants somebody with authority to do is to create enough of a seed of doubt that he can exploit. And that's exactly what he was trying to do when he was pressuring state officials, when he was pressuring Shea Moss and Ruby Freeman, and when he was sitting down with DOJ and saying, look, I don't need you to make up corruption. Gosh, no, heavens, I just need you to say it was corrupt. And then we'll take on all the dirty work of confusing the American people and destroying their faith in an election.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but when Donald Trump threatened to fire Rosen, didn't other DOJ officials sit him down in the Oval Office and threaten to resign en masse if he did that?
Yeah, and they basically called it a suicide pact, where they basically told the president. So here's the interesting thing. So I'm blanking on his name, Eastman or whoever it wasn't Eastman, but Jeffrey, whatever, the other guy that basically Donald Trump wanted to be attorney general. Mm-hmm. Actually, if you look at the Jeffrey Clark. If you look at the White House visitors log from that day, the White House visitors log records Jeffrey Clark as acting attorney general. The interesting thing about that is it means that action to make Jeffrey Clark, who was just an environmental lawyer that nobody had ever heard of, to make him acting attorney general had actually happened. And so technically Jeff Rosen was out. The difference is basically everybody came together from DOJ, all these bigwigs, sat down with the president. They had a debate with Jeffrey Clark, where Jeffrey Clark was saying, in essence, kissing up to Donald Trump, and said, we're all going to resign if you do this. And Trump, at that point, had no choice. But I'm going to tell you, you take 2028 or whatever year that's going to be when Donald Trump is about out of office, and if he wins, and everybody's sitting around that Oval Office, you are not going to have people occupying those positions that would do that, because he's made it very clear. The cost of entry to a new Trump administration is to say the election was stolen, and to basically swear an allegiance not to the Constitution but to him.
Yeah, that actually brings me on to my next question. How big of a threat do you think a second Trump term would be? Because a lot of people make the argument that the guardrails held during his first term, barely, but because they held on, that we should toss him the keys to the truck and let him try to drive off the road again. But to build on your point, Donald Trump wouldn't be starting fresh in
Right.
2025. He would be picking up exactly where he left off in January of 2021. So, how big of a concern do you think Project 2025 is? Other people in the Trump administration that will now be loyalists, Trump's plan to appoint thousands, tens of thousands of trained and vetted civil servants in key positions of power. How big of a threat do you think this is? Do you think our institutions can withhold a second Trump term?
It's mass. This is a massive implications. Can our institutions hold? I don't know. Because let's think of it this way: the guardrails of democracy. So let's use the guardrail example. Okay. First off, the guardrail was actually hit by a car that was stopped on election day and then had 3 months to accelerate. So basically, a short distance, let's call it, to accelerate and hit that guardrail. So it didn't hit it with a lot of impact because they were kind of building this steal the election plane on the fly, right? And so the guardrails held. They're going to have a running start. I mean, they're going to be able to hit this guardrail at 100 miles an hour in a Mack truck now. Secondarily, guardrails on the interstate, if you've ever seen them hit, and I'm sure you have, if they get hit, yes, it's going to keep the car on the bridge, but that guardrail is mangled, and a second impact will tear it off, and that car will go off into the water. Now, I get it. It's heavy on analogy, but it's true, which is the first time to attempt to kind of bust through, democracy, they were inventing this as they went, and they failed. But every failure is a lesson, something you can learn from. And they not only learned from where they failed, they sat around and said, okay, here's how we can do it better next time. Let me give you an example. If they could go back in time, what I think they would do is go back in time and actually, before the states certified the election, they would basically do what they did on January 6th, maybe without the violence, but with the attempt to kind of change the outcome of the election in state legislatures. Because what they were initially trying to do on January 6th was get Mike Pence to send these different states like Pennsylvania back to the state legislature to reassess or to recertify. And you can imagine the chaos that would have enveloped Arizona, for instance, right? If all of a sudden, well, now they're going to know all those plans and be able to fight that battle everywhere. And while he's president, if he's president, they're going to be building for 4 years the machinery to both implement whatever they want to do and also neuter the opposition within the federal government. Look, yes, their civil service gets a bad rap. Sometimes it's earned, sometimes it's not. But it's a necessary function of a big government or of a big country. The idea of stripping that away, people have not even begun to understand the impact of what that would have on our country.
And the scariest part is, I think if Trump and his administration succeeded with that quiet coup that you just described, the one that didn't even involve any violence, I'm not sure the average apolitical American citizen would even understand what happened. They'll realize
Yep.
gas prices haven't really gone up since this has happened. They'll realize my situation hasn't really changed since this has happened. They won't even know who to believe about it. They won't know, do I believe CNN about this? Do I believe Sean Hannity on Fox News? So yeah, this slow erosion of norms with also like American citizens just not really paying attention is, I think, a recipe for disaster. Yeah.
It is. And let me just add to that. The other concern is, and it's what Donald Trump does really well. Okay. It's because he's psycho, and like psychos do this. Like he just throws so much information against the wall. So if you're sitting here and let's say we're in 2028 or 5 or whatever, and Pennsylvania gets, there's a fight in the Pennsylvania government about who to certify, even though Joe Biden wins Pennsylvania. You turn on Fox, Fox says this is all legitimate, a legitimate action in the Pennsylvania House. You turn on CNN, CNN's like, this is illegitimate. You sit there as an average American that doesn't necessarily know because you have a life to live. You sit there and go, I don't know, right? I don't know. So therefore, yeah, like you said, gas hasn't gone up. I'll just let it be. I'm not going to go to war over this.
Yeah, it's terrifying. From my understanding, Trump is trying to copy that model from Hungary that they implemented there, that slow erosion of norms, stripping different agencies of their independency. And it could absolutely happen. And I feel like most people would not really realize. I also want to ask you, it's kind of a broad question, but who do you think is going to win this upcoming election? Do you think it's a coin flip? Do you think that Biden's still the favorite?
Man, it's such a question. I mean, It depends what day you ask me.
For real.
If you ask me today, I think Donald Trump's going to win. If you'd asked me a week ago, I was pretty optimistic Joe Biden was going to win. I guess the actual answer is it's a coin toss.
Yeah.
But here's the question: is let me be critical of the Biden administration for a second. I haven't heard much from him, right? As far as I know, even Liz Cheney hasn't been reached out to. Maybe she has been. I haven't talked to her about it. I don't think Chris Christie has. There's a lot of disaffected Republicans that want to build what I've called this kind of unstable, uncomfortable coalition between the sane right, the center, and the left.
Yep.
Okay, to defend democracy. They have not. They reached out to me in January and basically said, "Hey, after Nikki Haley's out, we'll definitely want to use you." And I'm like, okay, look, I don't need this for my ego. And trust me, my life would be better if I didn't have to go on the trail for Joe Biden, but I'm willing to. But the question is, why aren't they reaching out to that center? Obviously they have a battle on the left on the Gaza issue too. And so I feel like the messaging of the administration is kind of all over the place. And the problem with that, like, I get it. These are tough issues. So it's not critical in terms of how the stands are taking on the issues. But the problem with that is they're up against a guy that has somehow convinced, even though he's actually the weakest, whiniest, smelliest, man that's ever existed, truly. But he's convinced Americans that he's tough. Yep. Americans like a tough president. Biden, in contrast, doesn't look tough. So if I had to predict it, because I'm an optimist, I still think Joe Biden's going to win. It's just that we're in a bad moment. But, man, we can't take this for granted. We cannot take this for granted.
What you said has been my exact experience. Like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was literally making bets with my friends that Joe Biden would sweep. I was like, he's going to cruise to re-election. Then you see videos of pro-Palestine protesters and Trump protesters both chanting F Joe Biden at the same time. And you're like, we might be in a little bit of trouble here. I'm going to play for you a clip really quickly of me talking to a Trump supporter about Ukraine. Actually, it's 2 separate clips. You may enjoy them. It's 90 seconds, so it's a little bit long, but it's worth it. What do you think about the funding of Ukraine?
No, I don't think that should happen.
Why not?
Because we need to take care of America first.
America first? I agree, but I'd make the argument that funding Ukraine is exactly how we put America first, because a lot of people think we're sending cash bags, but we're sending old military equipment, right? And after we send that military equipment, we get to create new American jobs to restock and repile that, right?
That's a good point.
On top of that, so to piece my argument together, we're creating new American jobs, and in the process, we get to protect an ally, a sovereign country, Ukraine, from, I think Vladimir Putin is a dictator. He's a threat. He's not a good guy. So I think we're protecting America's interests. I think this is exactly how we put America first, right? Can you see that point of view?
That is a very good point. That's a good point. You've educated me a lot. I appreciate that.
Awesome. And we're both coming from the same point of view of putting America first.
Right.
How can we put America first on the world stage? And sometimes it scares me when they say we put America first by letting Vladimir Putin do what he wants. That doesn't make sense.
Right. And how old are you?
21.
You're very wise for your age.
Thank you. I've really appreciated talking to you.
It's good talking to you.
Don't you understand? Russia is with us. They're with Trump.
Russia is with us?
Russia is with Trump.
Russia's not with the USA. One of their main goals is to destabilize.
Putin is with Trump. I guarantee it.
You think so?
You just don't know yet.
That's not the flex you think it is, though. Putin is a bad faith actor who invades countries, has imperial ambitions.
Well, why does Trump get along with him then? Trump gets along with everybody. North Korea, everybody. Everybody likes Trump.
Yeah, that's something to think about. He's so close. He's so close to the point. But that makes me wonder, how do you think Republicans, or MAGA Republicans in particular, have gotten so twisted where they think putting America first is being an isolationist, like it's still 1939?
I want to say first off, if I ever run for president and it's in 14 years, you'll be a contender for my vice president, man, because you can articulate very well. Look, I look at it, and to an extent I get kind of sad because particularly on that first clip, that is a good meaning person, right? Like he truly, when you told him the fact that unfortunately people don't understand, which is all we're doing is actually replenishing our stocks, like stuff that's going to age out anyway and making our military stronger. Unfortunately, they don't hear that on Fox News. They actually really don't hear it on many places because most people don't understand that. But you can see that he's a good, well-meaning person. The second guy, I mean, yeah, to sit there and say that Vladimir Putin is on our side or is on Trump's side, let's keep this in mind. The Russian economy, which is now pivoted to basically being a one-trick pony, a war economy that's funded by oil. It reminds us of a lot of Middle East countries. The Russian economy is the size of Italy against the United States economy, which basically exceeds that of all of Europe. If we want to align ourselves with a failing country, a declining population, with drunk men that basically all die at the age of 62 if they don't stab each other to death prior, and send people to where there's been 450,000 casualties. Every 5 days, there are as many Russians killed as we lost in 20 years in Afghanistan. If that is the leader in the country that you want to hold up on a pedestal, be my guest. But let me tell you, as a Christian myself, this idea that Vladimir Putin is somehow the defender of Christianity when he's prosecuting Christians in Crimea, when they left Bucha and Irpin, you see that they abused and killed priests and preachers that were there, Baptist ministers, Orthodox priests. When you see missiles indiscriminately flying into churches, there is no God I follow that would take a man like Vladimir Putin and say, you are the example of me. And unfortunately, these people have been abused for their money, they've been abused for their vote, and they've been abused for the power that every individual American can give to a politician by a terrible man, and now the lackeys that follow him, like, frankly, even Speaker Johnson and all the Republicans in Congress.
Yeah, especially Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marjorie Taylor Greene. But it really feels like a lot of this is a function of Russian propaganda seeping into the mainstream. I mean, you have people like Tucker Carlson, who actually, he's not on Fox News anymore, but he was spewing Russian propaganda on Fox News. Vivek Ramaswamy copying Kremlin talking points verbatim. Elon Musk owns X, and on X, there's a bunch of Russian propaganda. And it really feels like Russia is waging this invisible holy war on the West through Russian propaganda. So do you think, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say that I think you're absolutely right. So in 2015, I remember Dana Rohrabacher was a congressman from California, and I would debate with him on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He was a Republican, and he was pro-Putin, only pro-Putin in Congress. And people would tell me, Adam, don't engage with him. We literally think he was on the FSB payroll, by the way. And so, but 5 years later, or what, now we're 9 years later, the entire party is almost in this position. And I think it is absolutely the impact of things like Twitter. I think it's the misinformation from Twitter or from X or from whatever,
TikTok.
Truth Social, TikTok, that then leaks over to a Fox News story that then has millions of eyeballs. Or you can see the direct influence where a story comes out and it's put out by what seems like a normal website. It'll be like, the News Today or whatever. And then there's a couple of websites that pick it up, and then a mainstream media website picks it up because it's been picked up by enough. And that is directly traced to the Kremlin. And the problem is, in a free society, we're not pushing back against this. We don't have a government agency that's trying to, in essence, re-educate Americans about the truth. Because if we created something like that, Rand Paul would call it the Truth Department in 1984. So we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back and just hoping that freedom and the internet overcomes Russian propaganda. And unfortunately, it's not working.
That's part of the reason I like to have these on-the-ground conversations, because to touch back on the first dude I talked to, I really do think, I said this before our talk, but I think a lot of these people are just like my aunt or uncle who have been misled into voting against their own interests. And all you need to do is introduce them to new ways of thinking, introduce them to fact patterns they wouldn't have heard otherwise. Thank you for your time, Adam. I really enjoyed talking about January 6th and foreign policy. This was a great chat. I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, you too. I enjoyed it. Thanks.